last Holley how-to video I posted, one of the first comments somebody asked me to do a video on target air-fuel ratio, so we're going to go over that in this video. At first glance, this is one of the more straightforward tables in the system. However, I think there's a handful of things you probably should know that maybe aren't quite so obvious, so we'll go over that first. If I had to guess, I would assume the question was more so aimed of like, what values do I put in this table? And we'll cover that as best we can after we go over all of the stuff that you need to know about the software specifics themselves. So let's dive into the computer and take a look. All right, this file is just one of the 24 tooth LS turbo files that you can use from the base calibration folder from Holley. And if we look at this table here, which is our target air fuel ratio table, the values in the table are obviously our target air fuel ratio. Down at the bottom we have engine RPM, and then the y-axis we have manifold pressure. We do have this option here for simple or two-dimensional. I don't use the simple for anything. I use, kind of the max resolution for everything available. But speaking of resolution, you can see here that this is basically the whole table is just vacuum. 0.7 psi doesn't even count. So for here we have from 8 to 32 psi is a small portion of the table, so we're going to want to change that. So to do that, we want this to match our base fuel table. So you can either click on base fuel table, or if you right click on this, you can just go to y-axis source, which is just the fuel table. Now you're going to want to use this y-axis based off of what you're going to use your engine for. So if this is naturally aspirated, obviously you're not going to run 30 pounds of boost. So you would change that, or if you only plan on running 12 pounds of boost, then maybe you want to make this 15 and not 30. So the best thing to do here is going to be different for every engine and every combination, but you're going to want to maximize, what your engine is going to run at. So you can either manually enter in values, or let's just say that we want to use this range, but we want more resolution in boost. You can just simply right click on it, go to fill column values, and now our boost starts right about here, which makes a whole lot more sense for a turbo car. So we'll leave that like that. And then now if we go back to our target air fuel ratio table, you can see that this has followed what the base fuel table has done. Now the next thing that you need to know is going to be based off of what you're using for load sensing. So let's take a look at that. So if we jump up here to the system ICF and engine parameters, we're currently in volumetric efficiency based load sensing. So if we go back to our base fuel table, for demonstration purposes, we're going to make the whole table 100%. I don't know why that takes so long to populate. And now we go to our target air fuel ratio table. We highlight the whole thing, make it all one value, and we go back to our base fuel table. Everything's 100%. So now if we go back in here to our configuration, switch our load sensing from volumetric efficiency to speed density, go back to our table here, it's updated it for us, and our highest value here is 604, so let's just use that. Now if we go back to our target air fuel ratio table, let's just change everything from 16 to 12. Now the next bullshit that we click on, so click on base fuel graph, there's going to be a pop-up. It's basically going to say, do you want the fuel table to be updated to match the new changes for the target air fuel ratio? I think 100% of the time you're going to want to click yes on this. Now if we go back to our fuel table, you can see that we went from, 604 to 805. I've commented on other videos and I plan to do a full video on it, but this is part of the reason why I prefer to use volumetric efficiency rather than speed density. Now there is no right or wrong answer. Like if you are used to working in pounds per hour, then by all means use that. But when you're using volumetric efficiency, the target air fuel ratio is part of the mathematical equation used. So you can have a table value of 120% VE, and you can change the air fuel ratio, the target air fuel ratio, as much as you want, and that number is always going to be the same. So as to where if you're used to working in pounds per hour and you have the same engine, but you're running two different target air fuel ratios, then the actual table values are going to be different. And to me, like, using volumetric efficiency, I can just look at a table and immediately be able to tell either if something's wrong, the fuel pump's bad, the fuel injector data is bad. I can tell if a lot of things are wrong just instantly looking at the table, as to where if it's in pounds per hour, there's a lot of variables that are going to change the numbers, and I just personally don't find it as easy to spot a problem. Again, I'll make a whole video on that, but let's dive back here into target air fuel ratio. The next thing that we look at is actually going to be here in our fuel injector information. So we're going to want to populate our dead times. If the injectors you're using are in the drop down, that's the easiest way to do it. Fuel pressure, flow rate, blah, blah, blah. But this is what we need to look at for this target air fuel ratio table, is our minimum injector opening time. So this is the lowest pulse width that you can have. So for demonstration purposes, we'll just make this 1 millisecond. So let's just say, for the sake of conversation, you're idling your car at 1.1 milliseconds. You're getting pretty close to the floor of what's available. So now if you have a difference in air temperature or some sort of a table that's going to actually pull fuel down, so even if that thing's trying to pull 2 milliseconds out of it, it's just going to get to 1 millisecond and it's not going to be able to go any lower. I had a car many years ago that I forgot to change this value, and I just could not get the thing to idle the way that I wanted it to. And eventually I figured out that I was just an idiot and I forgot to change the minimum opening time, changed that, and everything started working as planned. So that's the main reason that I mentioned this, because if your car's idling pretty rich and you find that you're just pulling fuel out of the fuel table and pulling fuel out and it doesn't change, this is most likely the cause. And just while we're in here, if you look at the drop down here, so we got 1 millisecond, like almost all of these are 1 millisecond. And then we get to some of these other ones that are 0.8 or 0.18, 1.19. They change a little bit. 0, 1, 1, 1, 1. So the fact that like a majority of these are 1 just shows you that it's just kind of like a number's thrown in there. Like, I very seriously doubt this many injectors have a minimum opening time of 1 millisecond. With the Holley, like, this fuel injector information is not nearly as important as it is with like HP tuners or anything that's going to be calculating torque. So if your flow rate is off by a little bit, you can just make up for it in the fuel table. So don't get too hung up on those values. Obviously, in a perfect world, if you have all of the correct information, that's what you're going to want to use. But if your injectors aren't in part of the drop-down menu, if you use something that's close, you're going to be able to get the car up and running. And I just mentioned that because I see so many guys freaking out that their injectors aren't in the drop-down menu. They don't have injector dynamics in here, which is weird to me because it's like one of the most popular injectors on the market. All right, if we come back in here to target air fuel ratio, we're gonna circle back to that minimum injector pulse width here in a second. So if you just go to simple, you can see here that we have a 14.1 for idle target, 14.4 for cruise. So if we go back to our 2D, you're gonna see that basically somewhere in this range is gonna be our idle portion of the map. In this instance, in a map from Holley, they're idling it richer than where they're cruising. Now, I actually saw something, I don't remember if it was this morning or last night, from Greg Banish, very popular in the GM community. I think he does some calibration for GM, like the production cars, and I saw something from him where he stated that basically every car, there's no reason that it shouldn't idle at stoichiometric, and I disagree with that situationally. So let me explain. So this is actually a graph from Injector Dynamics, and the big thing to pay attention to here is the pulse width in milliseconds. And you can see on some of these injectors here, we get down to, what's that, probably 1.3 milliseconds, something like that. You can see that the injector becomes very non-linear. And then if we come here to, what's this, maybe 0.8 or so, you can see that the injector doesn't even work. So the big thing to keep in mind here is this is where the minimum injector pulse width number comes from. Is if you don't set a minimum injector pulse width, let's say you're idling the car at 1 millisecond and then another table kicks in and pulls more out of it and you run into this 0.7, 0.8 range, it might even shut the car off. So it's kind of like a safety net, so to speak. The other thing to keep in mind with the minimum injector pulse width is it's kind of a non-factor if you don't hit it. So if you set your minimum injector pulse width at 0.5 milliseconds, but your car never goes below 3 milliseconds, then it kind of doesn't really matter. But when you have like a small engine and really large injectors, it can become a factor. And that's kind of where I disagree with Greg's comment on idling every car at Stoich. So if you take a 1.6 or 1.8 liter Honda engine and you put a set of 160 pound old school Bosch injectors with no injector driver on them, you're not going to idle those injectors at Stoich. It's not that the engine won't run at Stoich, it's that the fuel injector won't. And you're going to be into such a non-linear part of the fuel injector that the car is going to surge, potentially shut off. They just do all kinds of weird things. So the fix to get above the nasty part of the non-linear injector is to just simply run the engine richer and bring that pulse width up. Probably don't run into that so much on, the V8 stuff. And if you do, it's probably going to maybe be like an atomizer injector or something like that. So just something to keep in mind. You will find that different engines, different camshafts, and different fuel injectors are going to like different air-fuel ratios at idle. So don't be afraid to play with this. It's literally going to be different for every combination. And depending on the exhaust system and where the O2 sensor is mounted, especially at idle, these numbers, it might not even make any sense. Like you might idle it at 12.0, or so the sensor thinks, but the engine might actually be running at a way different value. So play with these, and as long as it's not like fouling plugs rich, just make the engine run good. That's the biggest tip that I can give you. Is don't worry about what the number is, just run it where the engine is the happiest. All right, the next thing that we're gonna look at is here in temperature enrichment. And we have this air-fuel ratio offset table. This one actually started becoming a problem for me in one of the more recent videos that I did. I noticed that the air-fuel ratio was a good bit richer than what I thought it should be or what I had in my primary table. And this is gonna be an adder to this table. So based off of whatever the coolant temperature is, in this instance, anything, looks like above or below 100 degrees Fahrenheit is going to actually make the engine run richer and richer, which is perfectly normal. Just be aware of this. Once you get the engine to a point where it doesn't need to run any richer, just make it all zeros. And at that point, if this table is 0, whatever you see in this target air-fuel ratio table is now going to be what the target is. All right, sometimes I forget that some of you guys are really starting from kind of square one. So very worth covering here is the higher that this number is, the leaner that the air-fuel ratio is. The lower that this number is, the richer the air-fuel ratio is. A lot of people get that backwards, and you can get yourself into a lot of trouble really quick. So I figured a picture would be able to kind of help explain this a little bit better than just me talking. I found this one online. Anything that you find online is basically all the same. I've never really looked before, but for the sake of finding something for this video, I did. So I thought this graph kind of demonstrated it visually, kind of the best of the ones that I found. You're going to start right in this range, which is basically going to be right at atmospheric pressure. So as you're cranking the engine, it's usually going to require a good amount more fuel. So this would kind of be that range. Here's your idle range. So this decel coast, it says 14.0 to 16.0. Usually you're gonna just shut the injectors off all the way in this range. So what the gauge says kind of doesn't matter. This is another one of those situations where it doesn't matter what the number is. You're just trying to make the car run good, and it's usually just gonna peg the sensor all the way. So kind of borderline irrelevant. So this cruising range is where you can experiment probably the most and get away with basically anything. So in theory, the more you lean the car out, the better the fuel economy is going to get. But you're going to get to a point where you lean it out and either one is going to start dropping torque, so now you're going to have to give it more throttle to maintain the same speed, which could potentially use more fuel. Or usually what happens even before you get to that point is the car starts hesitating and misfiring and stuff. So you're really not going to, the car's going to start running bad before you hurt it in this range. So just go a little leaner, maybe compare your fuel economy and see where you want to be. But most cars are just going to run right around Stoich anyway. So if you just want to make your life easy, pick a number and be done with it, just run right at Stoich here. This transition range is another one where you can play around a little bit. So especially a big turbo car that's real lazy down low, you see a lot of guys that are over fuel them down here and make them even lazier. The cars don't really make any power in this range, so you can run it more with the naturally aspirated air-fuel ratio as opposed to super fat turbo car air-fuel ratio. And then this is maybe even a little bit debatable. I think this is going to be dependent on fuel quality. This is saying low medium boost at 15 pounds and below, and then high boost above that. It's kind of relative. You got a 2JZ that runs 90 pounds of boost, like you're probably going to consider 30 pounds of boost to be on low boost. For like a pump gas deal, I would typically agree with this, that you can run a little bit leaner down here, and then at the higher you go on the boost, maybe fatten it up just for safety. And then down here, if we make any boost at 1,000 horsepower, we die, but everybody knows that, so don't do that. All right, now if we come back into our table here, so we already decided that this is our idle range, and basically this stuff here is going to be our cruising range. And then once we start coming up into here, naturally aspirated, this range right here would kind of be like full throttle. And then if we were forced induction, up in here is going to be our boost range. And you can see that the air fuel ratio changes on this file as the more boost we run, the richer it gets. One more thing to be aware of is if we go back into our engine parameters, we have fuel type, we have gasoline, and we have E85. I think Holley missed the mark on this one. I think this should be gasoline, and then it should be lambda. That would make everybody's life so much easier. But instead we have E85, which I don't know a single person in the world that actually views any of this stuff on the E85 scale. Now that I said that, I'm sure there'll be a few people that comment and say that they use E85, but that's not normal. If we had gasoline and we had lambda, it would make everything way better. All right, now let's dig into how to actually choose your target air fuel ratio. So if we look back at our fancy little chart here, you can see that there's a range for each one of these things. And the primary reason for that is because there is no right answer. There's going to be a different value for every car in every situation. But if I can help you break down this range, the easiest way to sort of describe it, if you go on the richer side of the air fuel ratio, it's typically going to be safer and maybe give up a little bit of power. However, if we go to the leaner side, everything becomes a little bit more dangerous and theoretically should make more power, but not always. This is something that you kind of really need to play with on the dyno, especially if you don't have a lot of experience with it. I have found some cars that, like the LS engines in particular, like they just don't make more power running them leaner, as to where if I take a Honda engine, naturally aspirated, I might run it at like a 13.5 air fuel ratio, but I've yet to see an LS motor make power anywhere near that. Usually they crap out naturally aspirated like 12.5, maybe 12.8. And then if we get into the turbo stuff, I'll run a majority of Honda motors, like if it's maybe like a max effort deal, like 12.0. And if it's something that we don't need to really run at the ragged edge, like 11.8, 11.5. And then you'll find like the LS stuff, 11.8's more what I would consider to be lean. And then, 11.2, 11.3, if it's something the boost is up there a little bit. And it's like a risk versus reward. So if you really don't want to blow your car up, then run it a little bit richer. If you're trying to get every ounce of horsepower out of it, run it on the leaner side. But then the other thing that you have to take into consideration is how much timing. So if you have a really lean air fuel ratio, you're probably not going to want to run a whole bunch of timing in it because the combination just doesn't work really well. So you kind of have to find that balance. And this is where everyone watching this probably just get real pissed off at me thinking that they're going to get the answer to their question, but there isn't a correct answer. Every situation is going to be a little bit different. Like I'll run some of the supercharged cars with horrible intercoolers and no intercoolers and crazy high air temperatures. Like I'll pull those back and run them fat, try and keep them cool that way, keep some timing out of them. And you really just have to play with it. Again, situationally, they're all going to be a little bit different. Now, another very important thing that you need to understand with choosing your target air fuel ratio is we'll use a single turbo V8 car, for example, on this. So we're going to have one downpipe out of the turbo, one oxygen sensor, and 8 cylinders feeding into that one pipe. So if our injectors are not flow matched, or we have a cylinder that's maybe not running quite as well as the others, or for whatever reason, there's 1,000 variables there, but our oxygen sensor is reading the average of all 8 cylinders. So let's just say, for the sake of conversation, the car makes max power at 12.0 air fuel ratio, and this isn't a real example. Let's just say that the engine blows up at 12.2 air fuel ratio. So that window there is pretty small, but if we have 7 cylinders running richer than a 12.0, but we have one cylinder that's running leaner than a 12.0, like we might get a 12.0 air-fuel ratio on our sensor, but we have one cylinder that's running leaner than that magical 12.0 that we just kind of made up. So that cylinder in that situation is going to break, even though our air-fuel ratio appears to be exactly what we want it to be. I try to keep that in mind. Like if there's like a number that I think is going to blow the engine up, like I won't run it at that ratio. I'll run it richer, just, you know, for those situational things. You could do individual cylinder O2s, you know, to see where you're at in that regard. You're probably not going to do that on a Terminator X deal, but you could also sort of verify that with EGTs. And then the third way, the old school way, is to do it through reading spark plugs. So again, if it's not a max effort race deal, you're probably not going to be doing all of your cylinder to cylinder comparing, but you do have offset tables in the Terminator X. If you wanted to, you know, you had one cylinder that you see is running much leaner than the rest, you can throw, you know, whatever percentage of fuel you want into that cylinder. So in a perfect world, we would run all cylinders at the same air fuel ratio, and then our one sensor that's going to be monitoring the average of all of those cylinders at that point would read the same, or at least very close. There's, you know, pressure in the exhaust is going to change what the sensor reads, distance, you know, sensor life, heat, there's just all kinds of things. So the O2 sensor, especially with the modern day stuff, works very, very well, but you need to understand it's not like absolute. And the other thing that's kind of interesting that probably piss you off again watching this video is if you put 5 different lambda meters in the same car, in the same spot, the same power source, the same ground source, they're all gonna most likely read slightly different. That might just be 1% or 2%, it might be 10%. I see some that are widely different. $170 AEM wideband versus, you know, a $3,000 or whatever it costs, like Motec PLM. There's a difference in price for a reason. So just take your air fuel with a little bit of a grain of salt, because what you see and what's metering might be not completely dead nuts accurate. And if your O2 sensor is at the end or very close to the end of an exhaust, like if you have a really short open downpipe and your sensor is this far away from the end of it, like it's going to read differently. Or see shops that will use tailpipe sniffer in the tailpipe rather than putting the sensor directly into the exhaust, which I think all shops do it. Sometimes you have to, but you need to understand, like this, if you're going to do that, you need to have done it with and without on like numerous cars, so you know what that difference is going to be roughly. Again, for the 30th time, just take your air fuel ratio with like a little bit of a grain of salt. Give yourself a little bit of padding, because if you just try and run it at max effort and anything is other than perfect, like you could potentially tear the motor up for really no good reason. Kind of like I had mentioned earlier before, like running them leaner does not always mean that it makes more power. So if it makes max power at 11.5 air fuel ratio, there's no reason to run it at 12.0. You're just shrinking your window for air for no reason. So just find out where that peak value is, and you know, there's no reason to go any leaner than that. And in some instances, it's pretty rare, but it does happen. You'll find that a car might make peak power at an air fuel ratio that seems like a little bit sketchy. And at that point, you need to determine, like, is it worth it? Is it your only car and you need it to get you to and from work and pick your kids up from daycare? Then I don't recommend running it that lean. But if it's a race car, you take it to the track on Friday night and you get 16 other $200 4.8 sitting in your garage, like, lean it out, have fun with it. So you got to make some judgment calls. So one last thing that I have to mention in terms of all of this is the type of fuel that you're running is going to make a big difference in your target air fuel ratio. For example, VP import or even VP Q16 fuels are going to run way leaner typically than even like C16 or pump gas or, you know, whatever other comparable fuel. So the fuel that you're using will play a huge role in what the air fuel ratio wants to be. So 2 last things before we wrap this one up. 1, I'm going to throw a link in the description to, it's a 4-cylinder turbo car. So even if you're like a VA guy and you don't want to watch any import stuff, like this stuff completely like works both ways. But I take a Honda Civic, we run it at multiple different air fuel ratios, and we watch you know, what the power difference is. When I ran it at the richer air-fuel ratio, which I don't remember what it was, maybe like 10.8 or something like that, the car was misfiring, it like barely pulled through it. And then we got to a point where it kept leaning it out, and it, if I remember right, it just kind of quit making power. So if you want to see that real time, I'll link that below so you can check that out. And the last thing is, I got to throw you at least a little bit of a bone here. I would say if it's a naturally aspirated car, full throttle, if you're somewhere in the 12.0 to 12.5 range, you're probably going to be pretty safe. Going from 12.5 to 13.0, every car is going to be a little bit different. I don't think you're going to hurt them at that range, but it's worth trying. But I wouldn't recommend going much leaner than 13.0 unless it's one of those weird combos that just sort of likes it, like a Honda, for example. You can just kind of do whatever you want with those. And then if it is a turbocharged car, depending on, you know, the fuel and the boost level, like let's just say it's something reasonable, like 10, 12 pounds, you know, you're on pump gas. Like if you run like somewhere between like maybe 11.0, 11.4 air fuel, like that's going to be a nice, good, safe range. You could probably pick up a little bit of power going a little bit leaner, but especially on 93 octane, like the room for air starts going like this really, really quick. So don't get greedy on pump gas. If you throw some ethanol or some race fuel in it, you can definitely get a little bit more aggressive, but I'm not a huge fan of making power with lean air fuel ratios, or even crazy timing for that matter. If the setup, like if you can turn the boost up 2 more pounds and make up that difference in power, I find that to be the safer route. Usually at that point, if you break something because the boost is a little bit higher, it's just a mechanical failure of overpowering it, as where if you break it with too lean of a air fuel ratio or too much timing, you could sort of argue that you broke it yourself, and then ultimately you kind of end up at the same place. So if you're conservative on your tune-up and you run a little bit more boost, or the boost is low but you're aggressive with the tune-up, you theoretically should kind of end up at that same number. So in one instance, the tune-up is aggressive, you might break it, but if the power level is what's going to break it, like it's going to break regardless. So in the aggressive tune-up situation, at maximum power, we have 2 things that could potentially break the engine, as to where on the other example, the tune-up safe. So it's just, if you make too much power and it breaks, it kind of is what it is. So, and if you really don't want to do either one of those, then just bring both of them down and just stay away from that breaking point. That's going to do it for this video. Again, I always appreciate everybody that watches. If there's anything else that you want to see, just let me know. I've had a few guys like request making videos on this like crazy wild stuff. This series is for Terminator X for beginners, so something like target air fuel ratio makes perfectly good sense, and the stuff I want to see versus what you guys want to see might be totally different. So if you let me know what you want to see below, then I can try and make some videos based off of that stuff. So I will see you next time.